Welcome to the Embodiment Matters podcast with me, Erin Giesemann-Rabke, and my beloved Carl Rabke. We don't have the luxury of living in ordinary times, but rather we live in extraordinary ones where the way we live in the next decade will make a huge difference in the future of life on planet Earth. We aspire in this tapestry of rich conversations drawn from a variety of wise perspectives to share resources to help you embody the wisdom, compassion, and skillful actions that are needed during these times. You can find out more about our classes and sign up for our newsletter at embodimentmatters.com. You can also become a supporting member of our podcast with a small monthly donation. Look for Embodiment Matters at patreon.com. Hello, it's Erin here, and I'm so delighted to share with you a beautiful conversation I got to have with Marika Heinrichs of Wildbody.ca. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Marika and where you can find out more about her work, and then I'll share just a little overview of what we talk about in this rich conversation. Marika Heinrichs is the granddaughter of German Mennonite, British, and Irish settlers to the part of Turtle Island colonially known as Canada. She is a queer, femme, somatics practitioner and facilitator whose work focuses on the recovery of ancestral wisdom through body-based ways of knowing and challenging the appropriation and erasure of Indigenous knowledge in the field of somatics. She is grateful for the nourishment and support of her peers, mentors, and more than human kin. You can find more about Marika and her work, and I highly encourage, if you're interested in these topics, you to sign up for her newsletter. I deeply appreciate the reflections I receive and what stirs in my heart-mind as I read Marika's writings. You can find that at wildbody.ca. She's on Instagram at wildbodysomatics, and she's got an upcoming course on embodied ethics. You can find more about that at wildbody.ca. Well, in this conversation, we explore, of course, what is embodiment and why does it matter? We talk about lineages of somatic practice and being in right relationship with and through lineage. We explore somatic traditions, cultural appropriation, finding right relationship, and all of the complexity of this. And the importance of having footing in our own ancestral lineages and our ancestors' embodied ways. Yeah, there's a wonderful vibe, I would say, throughout this conversation of sitting with complexity and not trying to be perfect or purist about any of this. We explore a lot of questions of relationality and the point of practice being to bring something back that really supports the world and our everyday physical well-being. We talk a little bit about the way whiteness, as many have been socialized into it, is about embodying disconnection and domination. And we explore a little bit about basic goodness, defensiveness, and growing a new culture where we can be caring and in respectful relationship. We talk about the importance of having a settled nervous system and nurturing our curiosity to even be able to enter these conversations. And the truth that shame-based strategies don't ever bring about change and learning. We explore something really interesting, just briefly, but about narcissism as a trauma response. And extremists from various sectors of society are actually looking for belonging. So we explore a little bit of how we can create belonging with each other, how we can cultivate not knowing as an important orientation, and the importance of growing embodied presence and curiosity while letting go of needing to know, getting it right, being perfect, all of that, and not knowing, being rather uncomfortable, but perhaps much better than these other options. We explore also somatics as an act of healing and also an element in collective change. And that systems of domination, which we see so many places around the world right now, the fact that they rely on severing the connection we have with our bodies and the importance of reclaiming that. And we also talk about the importance of building healing communities being just as important as individualized healing. I really appreciate this conversation with this wonderful person, and I encourage you to give it a listen and to check out what Marika is offering. Thanks so much for listening. So welcome, Marika. So happy to have this conversation with you today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. You know, we often like to start these conversations with this question, and I'm really looking forward to your answer, whatever it might be, around how you define embodiment and also why it matters in the world right now.
For me, we're always embodying something. And the practice of embodiment is about developing a conscious, intentional relationship with what we're embodying. And I think there are ways in which we are often unconsciously embodying values or ways of being or belief systems that don't actually line up with our integrity or what we believe or what we feel. Mm-hmm. And that can cause a lot of trouble in our lives, to put it simply, individually and collectively. And so, embodiment gets talked about a lot as like being in your body and feeling your body. But I think whether we're conscious of it or not, we're always embodying something. So for me, it's about the conscious practice of coming into connection and relationship with how we're moving through the world and what that's kind of carrying forward. I think it matters because if we want to change things, then we need to bring our whole selves to the change work that we're involved in and engaged in. And I've been I was a part of a lot of like disembodied social change work for a long time. And I just saw it kind of like, a lot of wheel spinning happening and a lot of like lateral harm. So I think it matters because fundamentally the systems of oppression and domination that we live inside of, in particular white supremacy and patriarchy, are really reliant in capitalism on disconnection from our bodies and not trusting and listening to our bodies and overriding our bodies. Mm-hmm. So if we're engaging with strategies to change the systems that continue to disregard the body, then we're only going to be able to get so far if we're bumping up against those systems. So, yeah.
I love that. It's a beautiful answer. I love having somatic practitioners on to ask you to maybe make an invitation to listeners who are zooming around in their day or not perhaps so, embodied in the moment, to how might you invite people to be in that process as they listen to this conversation?
Mm-hmm. I think I like to start with just a kind of introduction to noticing the body, like to just greeting or saying hello to our bodies. Many of us, especially if we're kind of in the midst of our days, are not necessarily in relationship or in connection with ourselves. And so that can be like a really kind of gentle practice of just noticing what we're noticing. Mm-hmm. So noticing sensation can be like the most kind of neutral or like easy sensation to be with. So it could be like the sort of feeling of the fabric of your clothing against your skin, or where your body is making contact with the chair or the floor. And just kind of, like saying hello to our bodies, that they're here and that we're all kind of, we're an ecosystem and we can fall out of relationship. And so just noticing how it is to even make contact or be in relationship to the body in this moment. Sometimes that brings up anxiety or fear or relief or nothingness. And just to notice that. And then to just like maybe orient to like a couple of different sensory experiences in the space. So visually, maybe noticing the space that you're in, different kind of colors and textures. If it's a place that has doors and windows, just allowing yourself to notice those. And also paying attention to different sounds, the temperature. And then finding somewhere that feels like just okay or neutral, which can be the tip of your nose or bottoms of your feet, but just somewhere that like is okay. Somewhere that doesn't feel like particularly amazing or particularly bad, just kind of is like, that just is. And then just hanging out and keeping your attention there. And that can be quite revelatory to just realize that even if it's just like a fingertip, that like a part of us in this moment is just like, is okay, is alive, and hanging on.
It's wonderful. Thank you. I know a thread of the work that you do is around working with lineage of our practices for people who are in somatic work, whether professionally or just, engaging. And I would love to ask you a little bit about your own lineage, and then also how you relate to the importance of lineage work for those of us doing somatic practices.
Yeah, totally. My lineage in terms of somatic work. Yeah. So I think every time I answer this question, different things show up. But what feels true to me is that the first kind of like place where I learned to have an experience of embodiment was being a kid playing in the forest. And that was where I experienced a lot of what I understand to be embodiment. And was a real like refuge and source of protection and resilience for me. And I was raised by my mom. I was raised by both my parents, but my mom is a psychotherapist, and she has spent many, many years practicing focusing-oriented psychotherapy. And so there are ways that her like orientation to the body and the felt sense were very present, I think, through my life before I even knew what those things were. But I she would ask me about dreams and like images and where I felt things in my body. And I think that like somehow kind of, introduced into my consciousness at a young age that was a domain that I could kind of pay attention to and that had like wisdom. And then when I was in my early 20s, I was experiencing panic attacks and really bad anxiety, kind of like for the first time. And I went to like 1 or 2 sessions of talk therapy, and it just was like the worst. Like it just felt so uncomfortable. This person was just kind of telling me how things were. And I just like somehow intuitively knew that I needed to like find a body worker. And I don't know how I knew that. Like, I don't know how I even knew what body work was. Like the whole thing is a bit mysterious to me, but I had my girlfriend at the time, her therapist made a referral to this person who I ended up working with for many years, who's trained in a lineage called Brennan integration work. And that was where I started to really get to know my body as a site of healing. And it was really powerful for me. And then zoom ahead, probably like another decade, and I, through organizing and activism, found my way into a generative somatics workshop, kind of like not really even knowing we have these like moments when we look back on them and we're like, how did I find that? What was I? But someone was like, hey, there is this workshop that's combining like the body and trauma and social justice. Mm-hmm. And I was like, yes, I need to be there. And there's like a lot of ways that I was thinking about how those things were kind of like coming together. But it was the first time I think I'd like known of a place that was holding space for the intersections of those things. And it was at a particular time when I was really needing that. So, mm-hmm. So I sort of discovered somatics in that way. And then just kind of like a few years later, I trained as a psychotherapist and I moved to a city where there was a generative somatics practitioner who I got to start working with. And then I did some training with that organization. And then I, for lots of different reasons, felt like I really needed more of an understanding of working developmentally. And so I sort of like hopped around. I did a module of somatic experiencing and it didn't feel like quite what I was looking for. Mm-hmm. And then I started a training in biodynamic craniosacral therapy, which was really powerful, really shifted my practice. And throughout that time, I was like working with a supervisor in my therapy practice who was a sensory motor psychotherapist. And so I just was kind of like gathering all these I did my focusing certification. And then eventually I found my way to neuroaffective touch, which is a bodywork modality that specifically sort of focuses on developmental and preverbal trauma. And I've just done lots of other things, but I think the kind of the core lineages that I feel like really like are really embodied for me are generative somatics and craniosacral therapy, and focusing, mm-hmm. along with kind of sort of transpersonal and psychotherapeutic attachment trauma work models. And then I found NA Touch, which was just this like beautiful synthesis of so many of those things. So, yeah, and I could say so many other things about that, but I'll stop there.
Yeah. And so do you work with clients as well as, I know you through your email list and what I see you offering online, which is for a lot of other somatic practitioners or people interested in that work. Do you do individual work with people also?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a private practice as a psychotherapist, as a somatic psychotherapist. And that was kind of I've been doing that for a lot longer than I've been doing this kind of like teaching consulting work, which is a newer thing within the last few years.
That's great. So let's talk about lineage and appropriation and, the fumbling towards some kind of better, I don't want to say right relationship, but better relationship with the sources of where many somatic practices come from. I've been really curious about how you speak about that. Love to hear you unpack it a bit.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's so complex because we all have bodies and we all come from people who had some kind of embodied wisdom tradition.
Mm-hmm. Once upon a time, at least.
Once upon a time, yeah. Lived inside of cosmologies that understood the body as like a relational, like living kind of system and process. And there has been this like profound disconnection from that for many of us. And in that like place of loss and emptiness, we have, and I guess I'm specifically speaking to like other white bodies here, mm-hmm. really like in the like hunger and deprivation and entitlement and kind of whiteness, have found ourselves really like grasping and grabbing at lineages that are not our own, without respect or permission or a lot of like understanding. Mm-hmm. And somatics is complicated because one of my teachers likes to say, it's a fiction. It's like, there is no somatics. It's actually an umbrella term that like existed as a way to try and like bring all of these different pathways together. Mm-hmm. And there are there are influences from basically every continent, every part of the world that have gone into this like thing that we call somatics. A lot of like East and Southeast Asian influences, a lot of influences from like African dance and movement, and also a lot of influences from Western Europe and post World War II. So there's so much like density in the lineage of this thing that has largely been kind of branded and taught as like ahistorical, invented by, 3 or 4 like old white men like 20 years ago, and taught in this really kind of like stripped away from culture and context and spirituality kind of like clinical way. Mm-hmm. That like means we lose all of that potency and like beauty and the ways of being that contributed to these different lineages. And so for me, it's just been kind of a process of like starting with just like, as a person engaging with these practices, how do I acknowledge them and honor them and name them? Mm-hmm. But then really deepening into, it's not just about acknowledgement. Part of acknowledgement is also understanding the context in which something developed and emerged. And once we start to understand like a lineage like Tantra or different pathways of yoga or Buddhism or certain kinds of like folk dance, there are these like entire systems that they exist inside of, like entire worldviews and relationships and sophisticated philosophies that like, are so much a part of understanding that those practices. Mm-hmm. And so it became clear to me that there was something about like recontextualizing the practice in its like culture and like base and like where the kind of like the living sort of system that it is a part of. Mm-hmm. And then, the only other thing I'll say about this is that it became really clear for me that without having any kind of like grounding or footing in my own peoples and an embodied sense of like who they were and how they experienced their bodies and how they experience, as much as we can ever really know these things, mm-hmm. I couldn't really be in good relationship with yoga or craniosacral or so many of these other traditions that descend from BIPOC, that I was not able to. I could learn from teachers from those cultures. I could practice mutual aid. I could acknowledge, like, all of that was important, but there was still this like emptiness and this like missing piece of like, how was I like being in conversation or dialogue or relationship? And so that really started the journey for me of exploring my own ancestry and embodiment and what, how the people I come from might have understood embodiment within their kind of worldview. So it's kind of expanded into a spider web. What started as an acknowledgement practice has expanded into something greater.
I love that. I know you've written a bit about connecting with ancestral dance traditions or mm-hmm. connecting with something like that. And I just want to say, I really appreciate the way you've brought this up with a willingness to kind of sit in the question. It's not like, if you're a white person, you shouldn't be doing yoga, or even though maybe that's a choice that you've made, you're not mm-hmm. saying everyone should orient in that way. It's really messy and complicated, as you say. I'm thinking of, as you're talking about lineages and culture, and this is not some somatic practice, but more meditative practices from my Tibetan teachers who came here and are so rooted in their culture, share generously, and they want to because they can't practice in their own place of origin, relocating all over. So the sitting with the complexity and not trying to say, I'm just so curious about it. I get so curious about lineage and had conversations with folks around particularly yoga. I had a long yoga practice and quit teaching in 1995. No, 2005 is when I quit teaching. Just seeing what American culture, North American culture was kind of doing to this tradition as it, our unconscious cultural values get mixed with that practice, and it changes profoundly. And yeah, what an interesting journey. And then I'm thinking of people who, in these conversations I've had with some, in anti-racist group of white folks, someone who was so sad and uncomfortable when this came up, like, wow, I'm working with healing my trauma, and this practice from this Asian country that is not of my people is the only thing that's keeping me afloat right now. And I've seen you speak to that. It's part of why I wanted to bring your voice, that has some compassion and can sit with the complexity and not a righteous stance of purity, or imagining we can even really hold ourselves so separate from touching each other in all kinds of entangled ways, right? Yeah. I don't know if that brings up anything for you, but I'd love to hear.
Yeah, so much. And yoga, I have a long history with yoga too. I was never a teacher, but it was, I should name that as part of my lineage, as well as, that finding a practice that had a structure, and that where I could go and it was accessible, and I could find it regularly when I needed it, was when there was no other, like the widespreadness of it was so much of what made it accessible. And it really was so foundational for me in my kind of early trauma healing journey. And I did a lot of soul searching about that and about yoga. And, I wrote this piece about when I quit yoga, and it wasn't like an intentional, move, like it just happened. And I think, like, I'm not, there are a few things that I'm interested in, like, proclaiming, are like, it's like my job to tell people they should or shouldn't do. But I can share that, like, experience of, and I think it's different when we're talking about earning an income from something, but it was when I started to have that embodied direct connection with my people, like my ancestors, and a sense of, like, their ways of being embodied, and practicing that, and finding the work of people like Alkistis Demek and Michael J. Morris, and these people of European ancestry who were exploring and experimenting with embodiment and movement within our lineages, that I just kind of stopped needing it. It had been feeling uncomfortable for a while, and it was like, I don't need this anymore. Like, and it really showed me how that piece around, like, cultural, like, emptiness and that, like, hunger for connection to something spiritual, and that, like, lack of belonging, definitely can contribute to so much harm. But also is, like, a very painful thing to recognize in ourselves. There's, like, a lot of grief that comes up around that. So, and I would say, I think people are often, like, as white people, we can get really, like, caught up in worrying that we're doing something bad or wrong and not wanting to cause harm. And if yoga is a practice that's, like, like, that it feels impossible to, like, detach from or to stop practicing at this stage because nothing else is available, or for whatever reason, that doesn't mean that you can't also kind of, like, learn about your own people and where you come from, and what they practiced, and how those things might have, like, commonalities. And there I think are other ways that we can be shifting and engaging in our practices that can be in, like, moving more towards respect and reciprocity for those lineages. I don't think it's, like, an all or nothing kind of situation in most cases.
Yeah, I love that. I heard you speak in another interview about not so much right or wrong as coming into relationality with various lineages.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to say more about that? I mean, I think you just touched on it, but I'd love to hear you unpack it a little bit more about, I'm imagining people listening who maybe haven't thought about this before or having some self-conscious contraction of, oh shit, like, am I somehow transgressing something? And how would you like initiate a conversation with someone around coming into relationality? I mean, you're talking about it with our own lineages, learning about our own ancestors, but say with like, you have a practice of qigong or, something that comes from other places than where our ancestors did.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think there's, so many teachers of those lineages speak about how to be in good relationships for those lineages. So learning about the particular like branch of yoga or qigong that you're practicing from carriers of those lineages who have connection to their origins, so that we can really have an understanding of what it is that we're actually practicing. Like getting into the specificity and nuance, I think is important, is such an important part of honoring and reverence. And so much of what I've learned about this kind of question of relationality is these ideas and like ways of being have been talked about by Indigenous teachers for so long. What we're talking about is so much. The relational worldview is an Indigenous worldview, where things have everything is alive and has a self, or is animated and has agency and is in relationship. And so for me, a lot of my journey with this as a white person has been through like, listening to and learning from the work of mostly Anishinaabe teachers, because I've lived most of my life on Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. But there is like this step to how we bridge that and make sense of it with our own ancestry. And I've been really, really kind of like in like a embodied study with some of Robin Wall Kimmerer's work. She has a really beautiful chapter called The Covenant of Reciprocity.
Yeah.
And she talks in that about like how we are in reciprocity with the land. And I have a lot of herbalists in my life, and they've also taught me a lot about being in, asking for permission, getting to introducing ourselves to a plant, all of these like really beautiful practices. And I think there's a way of revering or like regarding lineage as a living entity, that teachers are carriers of lineage, practitioners are carriers of lineage. This is why I've started working with practitioners. But the lineage itself is alive, is a being. And we can have a relationship with that, where we pay attention, where we ask for permission, where we offer, we make offerings in exchange for practicing and learning from that lineage. And in some of my sort of study and learning about the kinds of practices and worldviews of people from the kind of Celtic part of the world, there are very similar principles around any kind of journeying, any kind of work we do to transcend or transcend or move beyond ordinary states of consciousness. Spiritual practices, are the intention is to bring something back that supports the well-being of the physical world, to, whether that's some kind of like social renewal or it's in the service of like our tangible everyday physical well-being. And that there are very particular instructions about how to be in good balance with the other world, or whatever word we use. And that if we fall out of that balance and we don't practice those protocols, there are consequences. And so that feels like, oh, I come from people who practice that and knew that. And the people whose land I am on practice that and knew that or know that. And there's a commonality there. And if I'm practicing something outside of acknowledging and naming and context, then I'm actually like embodying that disconnection and that disembodiment.
Right.
Which is like, that's whiteness.
Right.
So, I think there's the piece of how we explore the lineages that are maybe more familiar to us. But then there's this like really important piece of like, we've got to know about our own people and who we are. And people often say like, but I don't know, where do I start? How do I do that? And that's where I guess a lot of the work that I've been doing has kind of been moving into, because we need help there. But I get the sense that it's much less about getting it right. And it's much more about listening to the like lineage itself to tell us, how to be in good relationship.
That's so beautiful. I love that. I'd love to read something that you wrote about this. Lack of acknowledgement and consent, spiritual bypassing, claiming ownership and superiority, prohibitive costs, lack of access for the descendants of the very peoples from whom practices emerged, no sense of connection or accountability to our own peoples, normalizing cis, straight, thin, white, able bodies. The list goes on. I want to envision a methodology of somatics that is invested in liberation, right down to the roots of the lineages and histories of our practices. If we're not tending to the ways that this field has been shaped by supremacy, we're missing a core component of embodied liberation. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to another piece where you say, I envision new old practices that reconnect us with our ancestors and carry us through mourning, accountability, and repair as white people. And as practitioners, we hold power around shaping these conversations in our field and in supporting these conditions with those we serve. So beautifully said.
Thanks.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to include, and I think this is so important, mourning. I loved, you wrote a piece about building solidarity among white-bodied folks, as you and I both are, so I'm bringing that, in anti-racist movements. And I know there's conversation really important around understanding that it's not so helpful for us to center our own grief when we're in mixed spaces with people who have really suffered the harms of white supremacy. But how important it is to have spaces to come together and mourn that disconnection, the emptiness you're talking about, the harm that's been done out of that. Wonder if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, it's, I think there's something to be said about different spaces for different purposes, different containers for different intentions.
Yeah.
And we're living right now in the culmination, the impacts, what all of this history leads to. We're living inside of the consequences of and conditions of that in a very much in terms of a very, very violent white supremacist reality and context, with, where people are facing immediate danger and risks to their lives and well-being. And so that is not that, those are not the spaces to bring, the grief about our experiences to. That's not honoring the current conditions of what's happening. And it's just not respectful relationship. It's like, you don't show up at someone else's funeral to start to tell them about how sad you are about the people you've lost. Like, that's just not how we do it. Although there's there's lots of reasons why that happens. And so of course we need places that contain and can hold and metabolize that ancestral grief, that intergenerational grief with each other, so that we can show up differently and with more integrity in those, in those spaces, whether that's in our organizing or in our just our relationships and community with people of color. And so, yeah, there's a way that like having that space, I think we can be really afraid as white people to like be together and to grieve. And there's a lot of reasons why that wouldn't be trustworthy, that are important to like tend to and pay attention to be really clear and like precise about what we're doing and why. But there's also an intergenerational mistrust we have of each other and of being together that I really notice show up in groups of white people coming together to like do work around embodied white supremacy, that I'm really like curious about how we don't know how to belong to each other and how we don't trust each other, and our backs get up and we get really on edge when we're together, when that's precisely what we need to be doing, you know? Yes. Of course, like with clear intentions and the right containers, but it just makes it's so transformative in how we're able to show up in the world when we're not just kind of like carrying around all of this like unconscious, unprocessed grief and also like rage and terror.
Right. And it's up right now, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
I'm thinking of in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition that I've, been introduced to and practiced with for a lot of years, there's this notion around that was really radical to me as a young person when I first heard about the orientation toward basic goodness instead of the basic sense of I'm rotten at my core, and if anyone really sees me, oh God, they're going to run away, and how powerful it is to settle inside ourselves in some kind of basic goodness, to be resourced enough that we can enter these spaces and be willing to be, uncomfortable, discomfited, grieve about looking at the situation. And I find that core piece for so many people in this culture. Like I'm thinking of, I think it was the first Mind and Life conference when His Holiness the Dalai Lama was gathered with a lot of scientists, and someone was commenting on something he had shared saying about people hating themselves. And he like had to stop everything, get the translator, try to confirm this with multiple people because he just didn't even understand that in this culture, people hate themselves. Like, you what? Like, are you telling me you know about that? And you know about that? Like mind blown. And I have the chills right now, just imagining if we were grown in a culture where you were just settled in your basic goodness, that you can screw up and you're still good. And then we can talk about how you screwed up and you can learn. And I feel like there's this core wound in this culture of that. It's so tender. I've sat with people in it in so many ways of, I'm so afraid if someone sees me, they're going to know I'm basically bad and I'm out. Maybe this is that wound you're talking about, the untrustworthy feeling of being together, and how much defensiveness comes out of that, even white supremacist culture. I saw this really sad thing a friend shared the other day on this social media app I mostly don't pay attention to, but she forwarded me something from where she lives in California. Next door, it's like a neighborhood, area kind of social thing. And people get really, it's not the kind of conversations mostly I want to be party to, but someone was just getting so upset about a woman who was an indigenous woman from Mexico who was selling these gorgeous painted hats and things she had made in their neighborhood. And like, she can't squat here. We've paid for our house. She just has a stand where she was selling her items. And someone tried to say that. And this person said, boy, you are sure trying to be all kinds of correct. And I thought, oh, that's such a dialogue that happens of the people who are so defensive around, I don't even like the word political correctness because it's really an intent to be caring and be in respectful relationship with other people. But all of that, I think, comes out of that deep wound and that emptiness you've talked about at the core of feeling hungry and bad and ashamed. And out of that, people just get so defensive and can't even enter these conversations we're having about with a settled nervous system and some curiosity. And I don't know if anything comes up for you as you reflect on that.
It's just like reminding me of how deeply I believe that shame does not, that shame-based strategies do not bring about change.
Yes.
And I'm really like, I really say that to like other white people, how BIPOC are surviving inside of these conditions is like not I'm not here to comment on that, like whatever you got to do, but I think that there are ways in which I've had conversations with white people and people of color around how, this kind of constant narrative of like shaming and reinforcing badness actually just like entrenches these conditions.
Yes.
And if we think about it like developmentally, it's like so much of that is like a reinforcing of the like unbelonging and badness. And a kind of like recent pet peeve of mine has been how like everyone loves to talk about how everything is narcissism and everyone's a narcissist, but like narcissism is actually a trauma response. And if we're going to use that word, let's really understand the conditions that shape it. And like, yes, whiteness is absolutely narcissistic. And like at the core of it is like deep self-loathing.
Yes.
And I was so struck by this interview that I heard with, not remembering her name now, but she's a psychologist who researches extremists, like people who become part of extremist movements, including white supremacists. And so much of what people name about being what drew them to those spaces was feeling a sense of belonging.
Right.
And if we as white people are actively contributing to the conditions of intolerance and unbelonging amongst each other, I just like, that feels, I can't do it anymore. Like that connection just feels so direct, and like the responsibility I feel to like hearing each other and seeing each other in our pain. And it's like, that's our work to do. That's our wound to tend to. And, so I think there's like, it's important work to do within the right containers and context, of course, and to be like thoughtful about how we're sharing it and how we take up space with it, because we do love to like be really important and show how good we are, which is all like a part of that, that response. Right. But actually, what would it be like to just do this with each other and like not need to tell everyone about it?
Right.
Yeah.
I would love to hear you speak a little bit about not knowing. And I heard you say something about that in another interview with you I listened to around where, how do you want to leave people, or where are you? And it was about a practice of not knowing. And not, that has to come from a place where we can tolerate the discomfort and we're okay in not being right and proving ourselves. And let's talk about the importance of embodied presence and not knowing.
Yeah. It's like one of the parts of somatics that I think gets lost in the Western context is that so much of what an embodied practice involves is just the space of being with sensation or experience without making meaning of it.
Yes.
And we want to know so badly what it means. We want to analyze it and dissect it. And, it's like as teachers and practitioners, we teach the things that we need to learn, where we teach the things that we're like maybe a few steps ahead of learning, but still very much in practice with. And I always find myself at some point in an interview being like, I don't have this all figured out. I don't have all the answers. We don't know. We just like don't know if this is going to work.
That's so honest.
We don't know if it's going to change things, right? Like I'm not sure. Like I'm curious about doing it in a different way. These are just questions I'm asking myself. I like don't have all the answers. And there's a way in which my intergenerational shaping and trauma in my lineages like really created, this tendency in me to want to know so that I could get it right and do it properly and be good. Right. And it was like something I lived inside of for a long time. I was an activist in that way for a long time. I was a therapist in that way for a long time. It felt like I just need to know. I need to know that this is the right, best, good way to do this, because then I am aligned with like all the best things and I'm perfect.
Right.
Which is a strategy for managing, shame.
Right.
That was passed down to me. And it's very uncomfortable for me not to know, but it feels so much better. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I don't have to do it all by myself. And I get to not feel so shamed and bad. And I don't have to constantly have control. Like that's another part of it, right? When we need to know, we always have to be in control.
Yeah.
So there's a way that our like consciousness, can shift into these like different states of being when we're just in curiosity, that make room for this kind of other world that we're like, all really, well, not all of us, but a lot of us, people listening to this podcast probably are like longing for. Mm-hmm. And it's like the consciousness, the master's consciousness, like won't dismantle the master's house. It's just like, we need to find different ways of like, surrendering the need to control and dominate everything. So it's very uncomfortable for me, but it's become one of the most like important places to rest into. And I'm like, this feels terrible. I feel so anxious. Everything's going wrong. It's all my fault. And then being like, I'm doing that thing. I'm doing the thing.
With a sense of humor to be able to witness that is such a blessing.
Many years of practice have gone into that.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm sure you know.
Yeah. I would love to ask about, I want to read something else that's just beautiful from your website. Somatics can be both an act of healing and an ingredient in collective change. I mean, we're touching on that in so many of these things we're talking about. Systems of domination rely on severing the connection we innately have with our bodies, returning to the wildness and cellular intelligence that lives in each of us through practice, education, and community is at the heart of this offering. Go on to say, I believe that building healing communities is just as important as having access to individualized healing supports, such as therapy. I love that. That's so true and so important to name. Do you want to say anything more? I mean, you say it so gorgeously there, but just want to give you a chance to comment on that if you like.
I guess it's just a like nod to all of the kind of teachers and like mentors in my life who really helped me to understand and drawn attention to the limitations of one-on-one individualized approaches to healing. Mm-hmm. And like that includes working one-on-one. It also includes when we just like look at people as individuals without looking at them in their contexts.
Yes.
I'm certainly not like the person who came up with this like awareness, but I think about so many, people who, and predominantly teachers and friends and peers who have embodied experience in different ways of being in different traditions, friends who are like who practice Buddhism or, were raised in cultures outside of whiteness or have connection to cultures outside of whiteness who are people of color, Black and Indigenous people. And just the sense of how isolation is not going to there isn't enough a resource in isolation to heal at the level that we need to address these collective conditions. Mm-hmm. And there's something like really beautiful that happens when we kind of come together. And like, it's just like, I remember having this like epiphany once where I was like, it's so interesting that we're like trying to learn how to like be in the world with only one other person alone in a room.
Right.
What a strange thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there is definitely something about that space, the privacy and attunement of it that's very special. Mm-hmm. But especially for white folks who are used to having our experiences like minutely validated in isolation, I don't know, it's not giving us the breadth of somatic skills that we need to be able to actually live in the world in different ways.
Right.
We really need to learn how to be together.
Yeah.
Be able to do that, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. Always coming back to systems thinking and, personal salvation obviously is a big fat myth, as we can see our interconnectedness. So much more vividly day by day, it seems, as we're in these times of climate collapse and cultural collapse or shifts that are happening. There's one more thing I hope we have time to talk about before you go. And I actually wrote you after you sent this email out saying I was clapping on reading your email about this. I love when people speak to things that I think about or talk about privately, with my partner, Carl, who's out of town and not here today. And it was about the problem with pleasure. And I found this so interesting because my somatics history, a big piece of it is in Feldenkrais work. I don't know how familiar you are with that body of work, but I adore that work. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways we're invited in very slow movement lessons to sort of reclaim, as Mary Oliver would say, the soft animal of your body, and that different kind of knowing is inviting people to notice how they can reduce excess effort and increase pleasure in what they're doing. And my sense of that is that it's very much innate. That's how we learn to walk. Babies are too smart to repetitively hurt themselves like we do once we get in our heads and make our bodies more objectified. Mm. And yet, after years of inviting people into less effort and more pleasure, I was so moved by your speaking to when something like that, and maybe that's not the context for it. I think that's a very helpful somatic inquiry to do. Mm-hmm. You were speaking about Adrienne Maree Brown's wonderful book, Pleasure Activism, and how pleasure can numb out especially privileged people from the willingness to be disturbed and do this kind of change that's so necessary. So I just said a whole lot, but I want to hear what you have to say about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is not the kind of pleasure that she's talking about in that book or in her work.
Exactly. Right.
I think since writing that, one of the things I've been reflecting on a lot is how like words can mean so many different things.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that whiteness is so sneaky is how it will just like reinforce itself inside of like co-optation is it's so adept at just like justifying going on with continuing with what is comfortable and easy and preserving and protecting.
Right.
Well, it seems like something is like shifting or changing or is radical, which like is one of the reasons that I like value a somatic practice so much, is that we start to act when we can actually feel the difference between like overriding and like actually feeling and experiencing something.
Yeah.
That gives us so much more choice and agency inside of systems, because I don't know what pleasure means. Like, I'm not a linguist, it's like people are using that word in so many different ways.
Right. And
I think what I would say is like, what we're calling pleasure is oftentimes an override or bypassing. Mm-hmm. We're like continuing to like, travel the neural pathways of like what feels good. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. That can be a resource to us. But we really need to like cultivate the neural pathways of distress and discomfort, because those are often underdeveloped in white bodies. And we need to like also do that. So it's important to, and it also makes me wonder about like, what kind of pleasure are we, is it an overriding kind of pleasure, or is it the kind of pleasure of ease that you're sort of describing? And that's probably different based on every person that you could work with. But my sense is like in the way that pleasure activism talks about it in Adrienne Maree Brown's work and other people, you know, there's also like a very queer principle around pleasure, that pleasure is actually a conduit for survival and aliveness within conditions of like death and destruction and violence. Queer people like really know that. Queer people fight to like continue to embody and like and make room for pleasure even within the conditions of danger and like shame and harm. So I suppose now more what I'm curious about would be like, how is the pleasure practice you have allowing you to also be with the discomfort and distress and like pain of, you know, what it is to be human in these times, and how are our pleasure practices resourcing and supporting our bodies to also like move through discomfort and stay with, be able to tolerate discomfort. Because all of a sudden there's all this emphasis on pleasure, but like, it's a lot harder to sell, like, be uncomfortable, grieve. Like capitalism is like very amenable. It's like they work so well together. But I think we need to get more specific about what we mean, I guess, with those words.
Yeah. I love that. It reminds me, I've heard this quote attributed to so many different people. Who knows where it came from? I first heard it from Stephen Levine, but who talks about, he in the context I heard him say it, it was about a skillful teacher. But you could say helpful practice, or I've heard it attributed to good art, is there to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable, and how to keep navigating that within ourselves. Sometimes we need the comfort. Sometimes we're comfortable enough. We can be the one willing to be disturbed to enter the healing and change that's so needed. So yeah, that's beautifully said. Is there anything else you'd like to just offer and end with, like something you wish people knew or thought about, or just anything you want to say at all?
Just that last piece you said about like comfort and disturbance, I think is a really helpful way as white people to approach so many of these conversations that this conversation that we've been in. And it brings up for me the kind of like question of ancestor work as well, that like, how are these practices bringing us into greater capacity to be with, you know, to be comforted and then in order to also be disturbed and uncomfortable. And that we really need to be finding a balance of both. And many of us are overdeveloped in one and not in the other. If we're uncomfortable all the time, we're not resourced enough to actually do anything about that. We're just living inside of it. And if we're comfortable all the time, then we're kind of fragile and not, we don't have the capacity to turn towards the uncomfortable and to address it and change it. And so whatever your practice is, how is it supporting like a balance between both of those things so that they're in service of each other? And noticing the traps that we can fall into around becoming too attached to one or the other. Which I think I'm not super familiar with Buddhism. I haven't done a deep study of within Buddhist lineages, but I know that concept of the middle path and is so much a part of that lineage of practice. And so often we see these similar patterns showing up across different traditions, right? So what's bringing us more into like the capacity to be present and alive and in relationship?
And what I love what you're saying about that. And I feel the need to say it again because it's missing in a lot of these practices that are so self-focused, that it's about how we are in relationship with our neighbors, our people, the greater collective, our ecosystems that comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. Right? That it's not just personal. We got to keep expanding our sense of self beyond this one right here, and how entwined our lives and our well-being are.
Yeah. And it's in return to relationship that we really heal. We just can't heal in isolation.
It's so true.
Yeah.
I hear how implicit that is in your understanding, and just feel a need to keep making it explicit because it's not that way for everyone, right? They're very healing can be very insular in a certain way. So I love what you're inviting. Would you say anything about where you'd like people to find you, and what you're doing, or how people might interface with your work right now?
Yeah. My website is wildbody.ca, and I have a newsletter that you can join there that I send out most months with updates about my offerings. And my main kind of work right now, I'm taking the summer off to really spend some time reflecting and metabolizing. But in the fall, I'll be offering under the next iteration of the course that I teach for practitioners, which is currently called Foundations in Embodied Ancestral Inquiry, and is really me finding my way through developing this kind of methodology that combines developmental trauma and a kind of critical understanding of whiteness, so that we can heal in our bodies and then heal in our communities. So if you are curious about that or want to learn more about that, you can find me there. And I also do workshops sometimes, and different things kind of pop up, and I'll be back at that in September, October.
It's wonderful. I recommend the newsletter. I love reading what you're up to and how you're thinking about what you're up to. And really what a gift. Thank you so much for making time. It's wonderful to be with you.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. They're so thoughtful, and it's just really lovely to get to be in dialogue about this, because that's how we learn. That's how I learn. I learn so much from your questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you enjoy this podcast, it's great if you want to share it with friends or post about it on social media. Also, you could make a donation to support the podcast, or find out more information about our classes and offerings at our website, embodimentmatters.com.